Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Louise Guillot. I'm a sustainability reporter with Politico Europe. And welcome to today's Spotlight discussion when we're going to discuss the role of forests in mitigating climate change and also carbon farming and the different role of forests in helping mitigating climate change and also as a means to develop the bioeconomy. But before we go on with our panel discussion, I would like to remind you that you can tweet about the event using the hashtag #PoliticoAgriFood, and also don't hesitate to ask questions using the Swap Card app, and I'll try to ask as many questions as we can to our panelists during these discussions from you. So I'm very pleased to be joined today by MEP Ville, who is a member of the Greens in the European Parliament and who is the rapporteur, so the lead MEP on the LULUCF regulation, so the EU regulation on land use change and forestry, with also Christian Holzleiner, Head of Unit for Low Carbon Solutions at the European Commission's DG Clima, and Maria Poyala, Policy Advisor at the Confederation of European Forest Owners. So just before we start into the discussion, a quick word on where we're at in the legislative process so that we're all clear about that. So both the European Parliament and the Council of the EU adopted their position on the LULUCF regulation, and we have now entered the interinstitutional negotiation, and we'll come to that in a minute. And it's in original proposal, the Commission proposed to have to set a target that Europe's forest and land use sector and agriculture would store 310 million tons of CO2 by 2030. So that's the objective. That's on the table, and we'll see whether, it's very likely that it's going to stay like this into the discussions, but we'll talk about that during today's discussion. So maybe I'll start with that and with you, Ville, as you are sitting in this interinstitutional negotiation. Maybe can you tell us a little bit about how did the first meeting with the Council and the Commission on this topic went a couple of weeks ago?
Thank you, Louise. And yes, I think it's an interesting time to think about carbon farming and new methods of forestry, because I think we have a common understanding between the member states, Parliament, and also the Commission about the goal of increasing carbon sinks in land use, and that means that. Basically by 2030, but also progressively after that to 2050, when we are looking at carbon neutrality target in Europe, land use sector will offset more CO2 or store more CO2, so it will help us in achieving carbon neutrality, and the 2030 target on 310 million tons, which was kind of like Commission's one-sided promise in the climate law negotiations to the Parliament, which member states haven't yet formally supported in the climate law. Now they are also endorsing that 310 million tons can be accepted. The problem in the negotiations is that the member states have a lot more different kind of flexibilities and loopholes, as we call them from the Parliament side, on how to achieve that. And we would like to have more stringent targets also annually and then post 2030. But the main message is clear to people who work in the sector, both in forestry and in agriculture and restoration of peatlands, wetlands, all managed land there in between, if you would call it, that there will be a concerted effort by member states and by the EU to support carbon action. That is the main message. So we will turn the tide of lowering sinks into increase of sinks and beyond 2030 into higher numbers than 310. Mm-hmm.
And during the negotiation in Parliament that you led, there were a lot of discussion about this 300 million ton target. You initially wanted to raise that target we've seen in other files of the Fit for 55 package, the Parliament trying to raise the Commission's target. Why weren't you able to do that as well and come out as the European Parliament with a maybe more ambitious proposal than the Commission had on the table?
Yeah. Well, as a Green politician, I tried to get the information from researchers and NGOs and all sides on what would be the realistic maximum of, if we do everything in agriculture, we support carbon farming, restore wetlands and peatlands and organic land, re-wet them, and in forestry take new methods. So the idea was that what is the maximum number of carbon sinks we can get without lowering economic ambition. That was still part of my approach. And we came up to a number of 490 million tons. Some NGOs have been speaking about 600 million tons, but realistically speaking, that would mean drastic lowering of harvesting, for example, in forests. And I didn't want to propose, even that drastic proposal. But then in the Parliament and also with the discussion coming from the member states, because EU had sinks of the level of 310 million tons in the early 2010s. So the Commission's this target is actually trying to get back to where we were 10 years ago. So some are saying that even changing the tide and starting to work on increase of sinks is ambitious enough. We have to change a lot in how land is farmed. We have to move towards more regenerative farming. We need to think about biodiversity aspects. We need to think about different methods of forestry. That everybody agrees that, in the Parliament at least, that this change is needed, but the pace was too fast. So now we agree on the 310 with the Council. But then the Parliament does have some increases within that Parliament's position. One is that we say that additional action should be done with carbon farming, which can go beyond 310. And we also say that voluntary markets, if a private company like Google or whatever, Amazon, there are a lot of big companies who want to offset their CO2 emissions, that these schemes would be additional. They would not be counted into the public data. So if they support carbon farming with their money, if they call themselves carbon neutral, that will be additional. So Parliament's position is still a bit more than 310 actually.
So Maria, I'd like to turn to you because indeed you represent European forest owners and you work with them and you hear from them. What do you think indeed about the state of the negotiation and what would you like to see in the final agreement that would also work for foresters?
Thank you for the question. At this point, I think the starting point for the next round of negotiations is quite okay from our point of view. There are still a lot of pending questions, for instance, when it comes to the combining emissions and sinks of agriculture and forestry as a common climate pillar. This is something that has to be clarified among the next round of negotiations, as well as how the member states are able to reach these national targets, because Parliament and Council, they have different views on how member states should achieve the targets in the 5 years period. Vilenini just mentioned the target of 310. I think we should not go above this level, because we also have to think that this is already a very ambitious carbon removal target, and some member states, if we go above and already at this level, some member states may have to decrease their harvesting levels. And at this point, we come to the question that what would it mean in substituting fossil fuels? Because of course, when forest owners, they manage their forest, they boost their forest growth, and in that way also the carbon storages, but also the sustainable forest management brings the material to the market. So I think these are the aspects which has to also be taken into account when we discuss about this carbon removal target in EU and nationally as well. Mm-hmm.
So Christian, I'd like also to come to you, of course, because as you represent the Commission on today's panel, you were at the heart of drafting this proposal, and in the Commission's proposal there was also the idea of having the sectors, so the land use, agriculture and forestry sector, become carbon neutral itself by 2035, which is not an idea that is flying well with the other institutions. So maybe can you tell us a bit more, why was that very important for the Commission to put that in the first place, and why you think having this sector, I mean this sector particularly, having this carbon neutrality objective is important?
Yes, I think it's such an important message that the bioeconomy could be the first climate neutral sector. So what we are seeing from the data is that by 2035, if you look at the European level, we could produce our food, our biomass in a climate neutral way. So without having a negative impact on the climate. And I think that's a very powerful message that's interesting, of course, for us as consumers, but I think also for the investors that are more and more looking into investments that don't do harm to the climate. And and this is why we put out that ambition as a signal, and I think everyone finds it interesting. But there are questions, okay, how do you want to achieve that, like, are there enough incentives for the reduction of emissions? Because what we are seeing based on our modeling is to reach that cost efficiently, the non-CO2 emissions, so from livestock and the fertilizer use would need to decrease by 20%, the carbon stocks would need to increase by 20%. But yeah, a lot of stakeholders were not yet really assured, okay, are there enough incentives for the emission reductions and so on. So we are very much on that, and we want to continue that. And don't forget, the next Commission will probably need to propose, or has to propose, our 2040 targets plus the policy design. So we are very much on this, but we also heard the call that everyone wants to understand better how can we achieve both the emission reductions as well as the increase of the carbon stocks in agriculture and forest. And that's something we have to take home and to work more on that.
Ville?
Yeah, I think the Commission's idea was interesting when it comes to also taking into account the methane emissions and other non-CO2 emissions from agriculture, mainly livestock, that is animal grazing. But for us in the Parliament, our main worry was not that it's too ambitious, but it's kind of like comparing two different things. So we wanted to make sure that the ambition in agriculture, the land use itself, is increased, that we try to promote carbon farming by keeping more CO2 stored in the soil. And I think here is a chance. My message also is that nobody's talking about less economic action, less agriculture, less forestry. We are talking about new methods of having to need less external fossil-based fertilizers, external nutrients. We have a better recycling of nutrients in the system. So the carbon farming methods will be such that they promote the soil quality as well. So you will need less fertilizers, and this is a big issue with current Russian invasion of Ukraine, that the fertilizers, we can't be dependent on mineral-based fertilizers forever. So we have to look at that, and also bio-based fertilizers. So obviously manure will play a role here, you have to tackle that, but it's already currently the member states' target within the effort sharing regulation are increasing to 2030 to quite high levels, and the methane emissions of agriculture, livestock are included there. So not agreeing with the Commission that we are not yet prepared to mix these two different things into one regulation. We don't say that don't reduce methane emissions from agriculture. You have still to do it, but you do it in the effort sharing regulation. And that means that there is an incentive for the industry to start working on this.
Indeed. Maria, I also would like to turn to you on this, because indeed we see these regulations and incentives from the European level and from EU policymakers. And the different asks also that they have for the bioeconomy, for foresters and farmers, on the one hand, making sure we increase the carbon sink capacity of our forest, but also that the bioeconomy should provide more alternatives to fossil-based materials. So how do you find that balance and manage these different pressures put on the sector and demands as well?
Yeah. Forest management for forestry is always a balancing between different values and sustainability pillars. So that's why our forest growth has increased in the past decades, and this is because the multifunctional forest management we have had. So this is a good example that the climate actions we do by boosting the growth using forest management and that the forest owners are engaging in committing to the active management, that it can be done in parallel with biodiversity measures, which are already taking place on a daily basis, of course, but also the aspect of bioeconomy development by using the materials that the forest owners provide and deliver from the forest. And I think all these different aspects need to be well balanced. And also I think forest owners, they need to have a stable and long vision for the future, that the activities and measures they do on a daily basis, that they are acknowledged in the EU policies, and that forestry is not only seen as an offsetting sector, but it's actually a contributor. And when we talk about biodiversity and climate measures, these are something that we can actively contribute to. And I think sometimes in the EU discussions, we see that we hear that leaving forests unmanaged is the best way for the climate and biodiversity. So, but we want to underline that forest owners do a lot like in active manner for these practices and measures.
It's interesting what you say, and also I want, building on that, to go to Christian to talk about also incentives that the European institutions can provide, and especially the European Commission. And the European Commission is preparing a carbon farming certification mechanism scheme for the end of the year. I understand but I'd be happy if you can tell us a little bit more about the timeline as well, and also what is going to be in this mechanism? What's the thinking behind of the European Commission with coming up with those guidelines, I understand, for the scheme? Tell us a bit more about this initiative and when it's supposed to come.
Yeah. I mean, up to now we've talked about the LULUCF regulation, and the LULUCF regulation is at the level of the member states. Yeah. Well, we think we need to move at the level of the individual farm, the individual forest managers. And the first thing we need to understand is really what happens on the ground, in the true sense of the word, and with the trees. How much carbon is there? Which measures can increase the carbon? And also the biodiversity, and so on. So we want to give incentives at the level of the farmers and foresters. And there's a growing interest there to provide more finance there. There's a growing interest from the member states. More and more member states have specific schemes in incentivizing carbon storage in soils and forests. So some of them, which I find a clever idea, take revenues from the emission trading system and put them to the use in the agriculture and forestry sector. Then from the private side, there's an interest. So like the big food producers, the big biomass processing companies like Unilever and so on, they want to show to their customers, to their investors, that they have value chains that are climate neutral. And I think that's a very, as I already said before, that's a very attractive feature of the bioeconomy. But that all of that works, you need trust. You need trust that how much carbon is stored for how long and how sustainably is it done. And we want to create that trust. We want to provide methodologies on how you can quantify the carbon. How can you say, okay, this guy is really doing an above average job. he's putting in extra efforts that are not yet rewarded by the market price. And it's done in a way that's also good for biodiversity, that's also good for, and I think that's such an important one with forests, that make our forests more climate resilient. We'll have negative impacts on that. The forests that we have now will not be the forests that can withstand the impact of climate change as we have seen this summer. So we really need to be smart about which types of trees, of species we plant now. And together with all the experts from around Europe that we want to gather in an expert group, we want to give robust, what we call in our slang, monitoring, reporting, and verification. In the same way as we started the emission trading system for the energy-intensive industry, we want to start that now. That really, and within 5 years, I would hope that we know for every parcel in Europe, what are the emissions, what are the removals there, and what are the measures that the farmer, the forester can take to both increase the carbon storage, to decrease the emissions, and to do it in a very sustainable way.
But do I understand correctly then what the European Commission is preparing is not like an EU certification itself, but more guidelines for then member countries to develop it at their own level? Is that correct?
So what we are doing is a very first step there. So we want to develop methodologies, and then we see who wants to take them up. And as I said, there are different financing options within the value chain from with public money, and we want to learn how we can do that well. So in the beginning, it will be a voluntary initiative, but I think it's also so much needed in that space to create more transparency. So I would hope that what we develop will really be or become a leading standard for Europe. Otherwise, I think we wouldn't have added so much. But for the moment, in the first step, we are very much thinking about a voluntary initiative.
Okay. Ville, indeed, I'd be curious to hear about what you would like to see in this initiative, as the Commission is still in this thinking process, so maybe you'll have some idea for them.
Well, obviously they are very much interlinked. So you're building a kind of like a regulatory framework on showing what is good action on carbon farming or carbon forestry and sequestration, also the technological solutions there. What we want to do in LULUCF is to increase the sinks, and these will be methods to increase the sinks, and companies can show that we are doing this and this is accepted as a viable option. But then I would like to say that there are two big things that are happening here, just to go to the systemic level. Within 5 to 7, 8 years, we will have data on how much carbon there is, what is the status of individual fields. So we will know the farming methods' effect on CO2 on the field level, not just farm level. So also in the long run, we have two options. Either we turn the subsidies of CAP, European Common Agricultural Policy, in the next period into results-oriented funding. So we will fund straight away the results to increase CO2. We can do it partly. We do it with eco schemes partly now, but the CAP reform was, from the viewpoint of climate and biodiversity, was a mediocre compromise, which I myself voted against. But the next period has to be something really more ambitious. And the same can happen also in the forestry side. So you incentivize results, and you can create markets. And the long-term other option, which can be also done within LULUCF post-2030, is that you create a certain ETS, kind of an ETS for land use sector. So you will be getting allowances if you increase the sinks, and those who miss in their sink targets, they will then pay for that. So you can create a market there as well. This is very interesting. I think land use, the way we use land will look totally different 20 years from now. But another thing which is also a systemic issue here, which we need to tackle, is how to make sure that there is no double accounting, that this is solid, this is transparent, this is clear. So we don't know yet how to do that. We are not yet there. And another aspect that needs to be included is biodiversity. So we can't just think about carbon. We need to think about how we stop the loss of biodiversity and link these two intermingled targets together, especially in forestry, but also in agriculture. We have targets related to biodiversity protection and to increase the sinks. So we have to make sure, and now the Parliament is proposing a first step here to include biodiversity monitoring also into the LULUCF. So in how you, then in the Commission you will have tools to also know that carbon sink action supports also biodiversity. And there is a low-hanging fruit here. We have a lot of destroyed peatlands, wetlands, organic lands in Europe that can be restored. I think that is a low-hanging fruit where there's a lot of support also from the forestry sector to start to restore land that was former peatland that has been turned into forest land, but it has often low productivity value. So if they are restored, you can increase the sinks and you can increase the biodiversity value. So we need to look systemically also at these. So if there is action somewhere else, it will leave more room for harvesting somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. And indeed, and it's also a discussion very much at the center of the nature restoration regulation that the Parliament is currently discussing. I'd like also to ask you the same question, Maria. What are your expectations for this carbon certification initiative that the Commission is preparing, and that you would like, what kind of features maybe would you like to see in there that would be practical, and that the forestry sector and that the forest owners are waiting?
Yeah, we are indeed waiting, looking forward to hear more about this guidance on carbon farming and carbon certification. There are still, I think, not much information and like concrete examples what kind of incentives it would bring to forest owners. The major or the main concerns we have at this point, that where do we find the additionality, for instance, for the practices, and also how this reflects the other values and what wood use has, and also the multifunctionality point of view, how it's tackled in this carbon farming, because forest owners, they of course are concerned about their profitability, and so we want to make sure that carbon farming is something that forest owners do not have to have concerns on their economic viability. So I think it should not be either or, selling wood or storing more carbon. They should be, I think, coherent approaches and workable together. Also, what I'm expecting to see is, because there are already like good market-based voluntary mechanisms across the Europe. So I think what we're expecting from the Commission is to see minimum standards or requirements and standards which then could be developed in each member states. And I think there are already good practices which could be can be used as a good base, but we see this definitely as a good option. Although we have concerns, but like we see this this can have a great future if it's built well, and also if the forest owners are taken as a solution and as a part of the solution, and we can engage in the negotiations.
Mm-hmm. Part of the answer. Yeah. And since we have just 2 minutes left, I would just go back to Ville and also ask you about like the next steps and what are your priorities for the next interinstitutional negotiation meeting? I'm circling back to the start of the discussion, but you talked about certain loopholes at the beginning. Maybe can you tell us a little bit more about that, and in which spirit you're entering this the second round of negotiation, and what kind of loopholes are you talking about, and that you want to close in this.
Well, one good example is the carbon storage products, which also the Parliament supports, but is more worried about that we have to really make sure that if we want to have bioeconomy and forest use of forest as a climate-friendly solution and not something that actually erodes biodiversity and carbon storage in forest. When you cut trees, you take away the storage basically and the growth potential of that forest. Then you plant new trees. It takes 30 years before they start to be a sink again. Then you will have an accelerated period of sinks. But if forest methods are too intensive, then you create problems as well. So we need to balance these methods. That is one thing we need to have. The Commission needs to have better monitoring, reviewing, and analysis, better inventories from the member states. And the database is something where we have a different view in the Parliament from the member states. So we really the governance needs to be strong in order to make sure that we can take the next step beyond 2030. And then on carbon storage products, also we really want to support higher added value products in bioeconomy, not just burning wood for energy. We want higher end products to make it more sustainable. They will store carbon for a longer period, but rules for those has to be then also correct, that this product that will in the accounting get a free ride has to really store carbon for a long time.
Yeah, I'll just give the floor for one last minute to you, Christian. And then we'll close.
We've talked so much about how we can grow biomass and food more sustainably, but it's equally important that we use it more sustainably, that we use more biomass like in construction products. We need to keep those CO2 bound as long as possible in the forest and then in the products that we produce out of it. We have like the new European Bauhaus initiative. So it's very much, and the building sector has such a potential to bind CO2 for centuries, as we also see in the building we are in, and we have to use that in a very, very smart way. We need to burn less biomass, and we need to use it in like in buildings where it also can stay for centuries.
Prioritizing long use over short-term uses, very much something that the Commission has been pushing forward. On that note, our time unfortunately is up, but thank you very much for your insight, for sharing your insights today on the LULUCF regulation and on how to use indeed forest to help mitigate climate change. I would like to ask the people sitting in the room to stay seated for the next session. We don't have a break, but thank you also for tuning online. And yeah, I would leave then my colleague Eddie Wax to the stage for the next panel. Thank you very much all for joining and for the